Hi all, so today I wanted to talk about democratic socialism and how it's an oxymoron. And I'm going to start with that specific example, and then I'll broaden it out to other examples of oxymorons that we've encountered in 2020, and try to sort of ask questions about what that means. Now, an oxymoron is, I'm generalizing here, I'm not reading it out of a dictionary, but an oxymoron is a term or a phrase or a saying that contradicts itself. So it's made up of elements that oppose one another. Like you can say, it's just a really simple example, but like a wet desert or a wet fire. You can just see how those two terms, like wet and desert, don't normally go together in terms of the way we think. Now you can probably rationalize that out in some way and have it make sense in a specific example, but by and large, it's a contradictory term. It's an oxymoron. Now, democratic socialism. Now, I'm gonna forego what the new definition or the painted over definition of democratic socialism actually is, because we're looking at the terms that make up the term democratic socialism. So what is democracy? Democracy is when the people or the population have a say in who controls them, or what the law is going to be, or who their heads of government are. Like voting is considered a form of democracy, but a king or a queen that rules over their entire nation or their people, and who isn't voted in by the people but is just there because of family ties and hereditary, that's not a democracy. So the people don't have a choice in the matter there. So democracy is largely when the people have a say in how their country or their government is run. Now, what is socialism? Socialism is when the means of production are owned by the people. So what that means is, in a country where you have, say, a whole bunch of farms and a whole bunch of businesses that are producing crops to feed people, that's a means of production, or it's a source of production. Now, normally, those means of production would be owned by the people who own the land, or the people that own the company that works on that land to produce those products. That wouldn't be owned by everyone. But in socialism, the ownership of that particular means of production is given to everyone equally. So the million people in that population all have equal ownership over that particular means of production. And what does that mean? What does ownership mean when everyone has equal ownership? Does it mean they have equal say? Not necessarily, because in order for them to have that equal ownership is distributed and controlled by the government or a head of state. And the control over that mean of production, i.e. when to plant your crops and how to distribute it, So ownership doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is going to get equal access or equal it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get enough, or that it's going to be distributed in a way that they want. Yeah, so you could get 1 million crops for 1 million people, but the government only decides that half of those crops are going to be distributed equally, so everyone only ends up getting half a portion of a crop instead of one crop each. But they still own the means of that production. The thing is, what happens when the value of that production is zero or close to zero? What if the government decides to plant crops at the wrong time of year and have it managed by someone who isn't a farmer and isn't experienced? Then you get close to zero output. So what's the point of ownership over a means of production when that mean of production isn't producing anything? So there you have the value of ownership turned into pretty much nothing, while control is passed over to the state. So democratic socialism ends up being something akin to consenting to slavery. So democratic refers to the people's choice, and socialism refers to the people's control being given up for their ownership. So you're consenting to have your amount of control given over to someone else. So consent to slavery is pretty much what democratic socialism means when you look at those individual words, democracy and socialism, and you combine them together. And that's why pretty much, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but almost like there's been no country that has voted in socialism. It's always been taken over by a revolution or a revolt or some sort of coup, where it's been instilled by force, because the people don't want slavery. So how can socialism be a process that comes by way of democracy? It can't be. It's an oxymoron. But the term democratic socialism has been given another meaning. And despite that meaning, when you look at the behavior of democratic socialists, for example, about a year ago, there was a video that came out of the Democratic Socialist Party convention. There was some sort of theater where they all got together and they were allowed to talk about democratic socialist type stuff. And in that video, you saw people giving up their own right to speech and behavior so that it could conform to other people's idea of what speech and behavior should be. For example, everyone was asked not to clap or cheer or make noise because it would trigger some people's anxiety. And even though they were told to conform to this, and even though they, for the most part, conformed to it, you still got people coming up, standing up and saying, excuse me, but I can hear a lot of chatter in the audience and it's really triggering my anxiety, so I need you to stop. I need you to consider my feelings, and I need you to conform to those arbitrary ideals. That's not literally what they were saying, but essentially they're asking the larger population to conform to a set of ideas or ideals that are arbitrary. Like, I can't read someone else's mind and know whether they're being bothered by what I'm doing or not. If I have to conform to that arbitrary idea in someone else's head, and by arbitrary I mean something that isn't necessarily set in stone. So the amount of clapping or the amount of chatter that sets off someone's anxiety is arbitrary. It's not a hard measured value that people can say, hey, look, we're up to this decibel rating and this is what people get triggered by, so we have to keep it under this particular decibel of noise. It's not like that. So if you want to conform to it, if you want to consent to such slavery over your own thoughts and behavior, then all you can do is keep lowering and lowering and lowering the amount of noise that you make until you're not saying anything at all. And then most people with that kind of anxiety will be happy. You still get some that'll say, oh, no. If I'm not hearing your voice, then I don't know what you're thinking, and we don't know what we're thinking, and therefore that's triggering my anxiety because the silence is really uncomfortable, right? So it's a catch-22. You can't win in that situation. Hence, the crux or the point of access of that particular oxymoron is the enslavement of one's self by choice. Now, what other oxymorons have we been seeing in 2020? Well, we've got the widely used term social distancing. And that's an oxymoron because it's actually antisocial to be distanced from someone. Whether you consider it physical distancing, which is what they've tried to change that term to now, physical distancing. But social distancing has caught on to the point where everyone says it now, regardless of what the official term is. But whether you're physically distanced, or you're emotionally distanced, or you're verbally distanced, or you're distanced from people just on social media online, either way, it's antisocial to be distanced from people. Do you understand what I mean? I hope you do. Because you need to have the context behind the term social distancing. You need to know why that term was introduced in order for you to add all the extra layers of information and context to understand what they actually mean by social distancing and why it was changed to physical distancing. Another one that I've seen in relation to that is I was in a bathroom and there was a sign on the wall that said keep your distance from other people, and it had, two people with their arms outstretched. Keep your distance to minimize the spread. And it didn't give any context about what it was talking about. Like, you have to be alive in this era of time, and you have to be above 5 years old or something to understand what the context behind this is and what extra information you have to add to it for it to make sense. But by and large, keeping your distance from people is maintaining a spread, if you know what I mean, because you're spreading yourself apart from people. So it doesn't minimize a spread to be distanced from people, unless you know that they're talking about the spreading of a disease that is made worse by people being close to one another, right? You don't know that, and the sign had no context. So if someone had woken up out of a coma and looked at that thing, or if someone was looking at that sign, 10 years from now, without context to what this COVID thing, this propaganda, epidemic, pandemic thing is, then they wouldn't understand the meaning of it, and they would see it as an oxymoron or a contradiction. And you have to consider what do such oxymorons mean to our psychology and to our cognition and to our state of awareness when we are we're expected to accept these contradictions into our day-to-day language. What happens when your subconscious is conditioned to overlook contradictions and hypocrisy? What happens when common sense is taught to be pushed aside for some sort of weird language or weird phenomenon that we've been told to adopt, which doesn't actually make sense? What happens is something called postmodernism, where the real and the surreal are blended together and interchangeable almost in people's minds. The kind of people who are unaware of noticing the difference between critically opposed concepts like truth and lies, or opinion and statement, or a thought and an action, or intention and behavior. So you'll start to notice in your day-to-day interaction with people and your discussions with people that there's a large amount of people growing who don't seem to be able to distinguish between objective reality and subjective interpretation. And that stems from being exposed and being asked to accept language and terms that are oxymorons without you being made aware or told up front that these are oxymorons. Just that you see everyone around you accepting these terms and not questioning them, so you also end up following those terms and not questioning them. It's indoctrination is basically what that is. It's conformity, group conformity. When something irrational or absurd is happening, but you don't question it, you just follow along with it, and all of a sudden you're doing things without knowing why you're doing them and without actually thinking critically about why you're doing those things. It's called group conformity. It's called indoctrination. It's called brainwashing. If you look up on YouTube the Ash conformity test, then you'll see an example of this experiment where people in a doctor's waiting room or some sort of waiting room are sitting there, and a new person comes into this waiting room, and the people that are already in that waiting room are asked to do something absurd and irrational. They're asked to stand up for no reason whenever a certain sound is played over the loudspeaker. And what happens is the new person that comes into that room and isn't aware of why the people are doing this person is peer pressured indirectly into standing up whenever they hear this noise over the loudspeaker. And what they do is, slowly, one by one or two by two, the original people that were in that group, they get up and they leave, i.e. they've seen the doctor, they leave, they go home, and they're replaced by a new person into this group, right? And eventually they keep doing this until there's no one from that original group in that waiting room, but everyone is standing up whenever they hear this noise over the loudspeaker, but none of them know why they're doing it, and none of them have been instructed to do it. That's indoctrination. That's group conformity. That's what happens when your critical thinking has been conditioned to turn off by accepting contradictory terms like democratic socialism and social distancing. So please ask yourself, what is this doing to society? And I'll give you an answer. It's not doing anything good. Take care, send nudes, bye, love you all.